Hello everyone, make sure you have your color theory note sheet out and ready to go because today we're going to be taking notes on color temperature and color bias. So color temperature refers to the relative warmth or coolness of a color wheel because colors can be perceived as being warm or cool. Now naturally on the color wheel, the warm colors are your reds, oranges, and yellows, and your cool colors are blues, greens, and violets. However, a warm color can tend to have cooler properties, and that refers to color bias. So color bias is when a color leans to being warm or cool in temperature. This leaning will dictate which colors it mixes best. So for instance, the alizarin crimson on top. If you compare that to the cadmium red light red on the bottom, you'll notice that the alizarin crimson definitely has more cooler color temperatures than the cadmium red light. Because it looks cooler, it has a more bluish quality in the red, that is going to make a better purple because it has a bias to wanting to go towards blue. Now when we look at the cadmium red light, it's a much lighter, vibrant red, and it definitely has a more warmer color temperature. So it's going to want to go on the opposite end of the color wheel and make a better orange. That's what we're going to be experimenting with today when we mix our greens. We're going to be mixing the greens with two different types of blue so you can start to see how color temperature and the specific hue will dictate which colors it mixes best. So let's do some experimentation and see the color temperature magic happen. In your mandala painting so far, you've used the three primary colors, the yellow, light yellow, crimson red, and ultramarine blue. We've mixed two of those three colors to mix our secondary color of orange and purple. Today, we're going to see how the ultramarine blue and light yellow are not the best color to use for the green, and that's because of the ultramarine blue's color bias. Ultramarine blue is a much cooler temperature blue, and so it automatically wants to start making a purple. Because it's a cooler blue, it's not the best blue to use for green because its bias is towards that purple like I just shared. So we have to find a blue where its color bias is slightly warmer in temperature so it'll make a better looking green. First, I want to show you what the greens will look like if you actually mix it with an ultramarine blue. So let's get our palette out. You do not have to do this. I just want you to watch so you can see the difference between all of the colors here. So I'm using my ultramarine blue, and I'm going to, once again, wet my brush, dip it in that palette, and then put it right here. We don't need too much blue. Clean off the brush and then drag it dry. And then I'm gonna dip my brush into that yellow. And I'm gonna mix that yellow with the green. Now you'll notice right off the bat that that's kind of like an ugly looking yellow. It's not very pretty or intense. If I would paint it on the paper, it kind of has like a, I don't know, man, like a booger, gross looking green to it. Now watch what happens when I use cyan blue. Cyan blue has a color bias that likes to lean towards the warmer colors. So I'll put some yellow down first on my palette, scoop up a nice amount. Clean off the brush. Remember, we always clean off our brush before we stick it into a new color. Gonna wet this cyan blue a little bit more. I'm gonna add it to here. Now look at how much brighter that green is. Isn't that so much prettier? And that's all because of color bias. That cyan blue leans to be a warmer color, so it has a warmer color temperature property to it, so it makes a better green than the ultramarine blue. Now this knowledge just comes from experience of mixing colors, but also analyzing each color. For your color wheel section today, as you're painting in your green hue, you need to mix your cyan blue and your light yellow together. So anytime that we're gonna be mixing our greens for the green section, the yellow green section, and then the blue green section, we're going to be mixing cyan blue and light yellow together, not ultramarine blue. Begin today by mixing a large amount of cyan, blue, and yellow together to make the green in your secondary green triangle. Make sure the green is a nice even green. It shouldn't be a yellow green or a bluish green. We want it to be just middle of the road green. You also want to make sure you have enough pigment there that you can be able to paint that into all of the hue sections in your green triangle. The first thing I want you to paint today are your green hues as the gradient wash on dry paper. So remember, for this technique, you need to have a nice amount of solid green that's mixed with the cyan blue and light yellow. Paint that green near the top of that hue section, making sure that you're keeping your edges nice and crisp. So I'm using my small rectangular brush since I have straight edges. If your edges are round, you want to use your rounded brush for this step. And I'm going to paint that green hue just on the top portion of this. And I'm always going back, re-wetting areas I've previously painted to make sure that it doesn't dry. Okay, so now that I have that green all ready to go, I'm gonna start doing that gradated wash on dry. So I just wet my brush with a little bit of clean water, and I'm dragging from the right to the left. I'm gonna pull back from the left to the right. I'm gonna just grab a little bit more water to thin out the pigment on my brush, and I'm going to continue this process where I'm holding the board at a 30-degree angle, and I'm moving my brush from the left to the right in a consistent pattern to create that nice gradated wash all the way down to that pointed section of my mandala. Paint your green hues in each hue section in this triangle section. After painting in the green hue, we're gonna be painting in our tints. The key for the tints is that all of the tints have to be the same value. So if you look at this example, this section behind all of the hues are tints. You'll notice that as the tints are going around the circle, they're changing in color, but they're not changing in value. They're all the same lightness. Same thing with the tints on the outside corners, they're all the same value. You're gonna be getting graded on how well you mix your tints and how well the values match from one section to the next. To check your tints, I would recommend using your technique paper, or if I've provided you, I can't remember, but if I have provided you scrap watercolor paper, you can, practice seeing how your tints look on that paper, or you could just do it on this type of paper here. That's going to help you assess how well your values are matching. To create a tint, we want the paint to mix with the white of the paper, because a tint is made when white is added to a color. We don't add white to watercolor, we just add water. So for this red, I only got a little bit out of the palette, and now I'm gonna be adding a lot of clean water to that little bit of pigment to lighten the value. I'm going to assess what it looks like by drawing it and painting it on my paper. It should be a light value. It should not be that dark at all. So I'm really happy with the way that tint looks, so I'm going to use that in my work. The technique that you're going to be painting is a flat wash for all of your tints. So if you recall, for a flat wash, same thing, the way we held our board for the hues, you're gonna be holding the board at a slight 30-degree angle. You're going to load the brush with your watered out pigment, and you're going to begin painting from the left to the right, and then the right to the left. After every 2 or 3 strokes, you need to get more watercolor on your brush to make sure that the paint is staying consistent throughout the entire section that you're painting. If you would keep pulling the paint down, you're gonna be changing the value of it because you're spreading out that pigment on the paper, which is why it's so important to make sure that after every couple little strokes that you're reapplying the brush into the watercolor and then brushing that next bit on. As you paint, you have to have good craftsmanship. So the edges should be nice and crisp. the edges of each painted triangular section should be nice and crisp. Avoid painting into other painted areas as well. So here I'm going to be working a little bit backwards instead of going, you know, up and down. I had to go up just a little bit, but now I'm going to go back up to this corner. And as I paint, I'm just going to constantly dab some wet watercolor onto this area I've previously painted, just to make sure it does not dry and create a harsh outline. Remember, it's a constant from left to right, then right to left. And after you've done a couple strokes, then you reapply your brush back into the paint. You have to paint every hue that you have on your board so far as tints. So for instance, like every color that you're seeing right now has to have a tint. When you finish painting down to a section, sometimes that color can congregate and get darker there. So I'm just cleaning off the brush and lifting up that extra pigment. And then I'll come back over here to where I need to finish, and I'll finish painting in the tint on that area. Once again, dry off the brush, pick up any extra pigment, and paint in the tints in the entire section of red, then move on to your orange, yellow, green, blue, and purple. Good luck. I just want to mention again, for the yellow and blue sections, just take a little bit of the pigment off of, you know, the palette there, and then with clean water, dilute that hue and see how that tint will match the others. Now you can notice that that's a lot darker than it needs to be. I always recommend putting some, you know, that scrape on and letting it dry, because sometimes it will go on darker and then it will dry lighter. So you have to kind of give it a second to kind of dry up a little bit. Maybe you can blow on it to help it out. But you do need to make sure that all of your tints are the same value, because if not, that's where you're going to lose points on this painting. Every time you are making a tint, always make sure you have clean water, because you'll notice that my water is now pigmented. So we don't want to add a pigmented water into a different color as we're trying to lighten the value, because then it will alter the look of that color. It'll start blending with the pigmented water. So always have clean water whenever you're mixing your tints. And as always, go back to sections that you're not quite done yet, re-wetting the water in that area. So like I'm not finishing one side and letting the other side dry and getting that harsh line. I'm kind of working back and forth to keep the watercolor in all my areas of my painting nice and wet, so I have a nice smooth look to that painted section whenever I'm done. And always double check and make sure that you've painted everything that should be a tint before you move on to the next section. After you've painted in the tints for every primary and secondary hue, clean off the brush with soap and water in your sink at home. Make sure to keep it vertical in a can, and then wipe off the lid of your palette with a wet paper towel to make that nice and clean. Then you can take a picture of your work, submit it into the assignment for today, and be ready to paint tomorrow.